Hi, and thank you for joining me for another short talk. And today, friends, I want to speak to you about fasting in Judaism, a topic that may sound a bit boring, mainly because of what it entails, i.e., not eating. But don't worry, we are approaching this whole sugya from what you probably didn't expect. But regardless, today, like I said, we're speaking about somot, as well as the actual fasts, both those that are rabbinic as well as those that are from the Torah. Now, mind you, there are actually many other fasts that most don't even know about. For example, fasts that only dealt with Kohanim, or fasts that were just instituted for a specific place and time. Not to mention the fast that modern day communities can continue instituting, like fasting for rain or any direct difficulty facing a community. However, given all these, today we're just going to deal with the majority of somot that Israel has kept till today in some way or another. And one of the main reasons I decided to cover this topic tonight is first to clarify the issues regarding certain fasts, and then by doing so, as it usually happens, we could help to simplify the practices. And then ultimately, once the practices are clarified and simplified, the next step is to begin stripping away the inessentials, and then and only then can we begin making them meaningful again. Basically, because why we do things actually matters. In other words, if for some reason you find an area in your religious walk that seems a bit pointless and monotonous, 9 out of 10 times if you do the research, you will find that halachically it is pointless. Now, Torah and halakha requires you to fast. The question is why? And being that the only Torah fast is Yom Kippur, we are a bit limited, at least from a Torah level, in knowing what is fasting supposed to induce in an individual. Now, in this area, there are many different opinions among Rishonim. However, being that the source for fasting is from the Torah, that's where the reason has to come from. So Torah says both to afflict, and some will say humble oneself on Yom Kippur.
Te'anu et nafshotechem ve'initem et nafshotechem.
And regardless what we may think this literally means, Chazal has interpreted this to mean that one must fast. Also, one could also make the argument that the word nefesh itself does appear in many cases, apart from just meaning person or the later understanding of soul, it could also mean one's appetite as well. Not to mention that in many places in Nach itself, it does describe fasting as a form of afflicting one's soul.
One example of this is Psalms chapter 35 verse 13, right? It literally says, Ineti betzom nafshi, I afflicted my soul with fasting and prayer. And another is Ezra chapter 8 verse 21. It reads, Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God. Le'it anot lifnei Eloheinu. Also in Sefer Yeshayahu chapter 58, the third pasuk, the third verse, it says, Lama samnu velo ra'ita? Wherefore have we fasted, and thou seest not? Inenu nafshenu velo teda. Wherefore have we afflicted our soul?
Now, Chazal further explained that afflicting oneself entails 5 things, right? First, no eating or drinking. 2, no bathing. 3, not anointing oneself. 4, the wearing of shoes. And 5, no marital relations. In other words, anything else you may have heard regarding whether it's looking or acting somber apart from these 5 actions is only opinion. And boy, my friends, are there opinions on this. But again, they are only opinion, i.e. the disposable kind. Also, the whole notion of not wearing leather shoes on Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av is really, from a Mishnaic perspective, nowhere to be found. And it's really actually quite funny how much baseless mystical nonsense is written by the Achronim on the topic of leather shoes during fast days, when the practice of not wearing leather shoes was only developed by some Rishonim under the loophole that only leather shoes halachically have the status of shoes. Because actually, the halakha prohibits the wearing of any shoes on Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av. But anyways, there are around at least 30 fasts that exist in the Jewish world. And can you imagine what a somber religion Judaism would be if we would have to endure such afflictions? Not to say that there aren't many Jews that don't do it. Actually, there are many Jews who voluntarily choose to fast on every 6th day. And you know what? If that's what you want to do, that's fine. No, friends. The problem only arises when someone in some way makes others believe that they are fasting or doing any non-halachic practice because in some way Judaism requires them to. Really misinterpreting Torah and halakha to just draw attention to their asceticism. In other words, Torah Judaism is not difficult and halakha is not a burden. So when we make it seem so, or make it seem more difficult or more complicated than it really is, we hurt it. And it's really as simple as that. But one big aspect regarding Tzomot in Judaism is a really big question on everyone's mind, and that's if we actually have to keep these fasts. And friends, there's really no hard way to say this, but the answer is that the only fast that you must keep, without a doubt, is Yom Kippur. Yes, friends, only Yom Kippur has to be kept in any point of time and in any place. And that is, of course, only if you are physically and healthy enough to do so. However, friends, and there's a big however, there are 4 more fasts that every Jew is required to keep. The only difference between these 4 fasts and Yom Kippur is that these 4 fasts are not obligatory in all generations, unlike Yom Kippur, which is always obligatory. And the 4 fasts are the 3rd of Tishrei, also known as Som Gedalia, the 10th of Tevet, which was when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Yerushalayim, the 17th of Tammuz, which was a day that many events occurred, in which themselves contain so many agadot, which makes it difficult to distinguish between them and actual history. But regardless, the last fast is Tisha B'Av, which was a day that both temples were destroyed. Now, to be 100% accurate, to all of you listening, the actual text of Zechariah does not actually link its 4 fasts with those mentioned in the Talmud. In other words, Chazal themselves inform us of the connection, which ultimately is fine. But regardless, Tisha B'Av is considered the most important of these fasts. Again, not including Yom Kippur, which is not enumerated in this 4. Because it was reminding the people of the actual final destruction of the first temple. How do we know that it was the most important of the 4 fasts? Well, mainly because it was the only one they reinstituted and kept during the middle of the second temple. And the reason that all the rabbinic fasts were relevant fast days was, again, to remind us of the events in and around the destruction of mainly the first temple, because they were really meant to be observed by those who could in some way relate to those events, i.e. observed by people who were in some way being psychologically prepped to build the second temple. Which is why today the average person fasting the 3 rabbinic fasts, or actually the 4 rabbinic fasts, could not tell you what actually ever happened on those days, mainly because, at least spiritually, we're all victims of the second exile, right? The victims of Churban Bayit Sheni. Actually, it seems that this was the actual inquiry put forth to the Navi. It reads in Zechariah, "To address this inquiry to the priests of the house of the Lord and the prophets, shall I weep and practice abstinence in the 5th month, as I have been doing so all these years." And this is in Zechariah chapter 7, verse 3. So here we have the people, right? They're asking the prophet if they should continue the fast that pertained with the destruction of the first temple, which they experienced. And then we see the prophet respond in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 18 and 19. "And the word of the Lord of hosts came to me, saying, Thus said the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, and the fast of the 5th month, the fast of the 7th month, and the fast of the 10th month shall become occasions for joy and gladness, happy festivals for the house of Judah, but you must love honesty and integrity." In other words, friends, because of the promise of the new temple, which they would soon realize, it seems that the prophet was telling them that not only would they cease fasting on these days, but that these fast days would turn into days of joy and feasting. However, friends, the truth is that the Gemara is really not clear if the keeping of these fasts, again, besides Tisha B'Av, was ever officially reinstituted once the temple was rebuilt. Now, Tisha B'Av, we believe they kept at least once the Roman occupation rolled in. Actually, some, such as the Rambam, teach that the fast of Tisha B'Av never ceased, right? This he writes in his Perush HaMishnayot in Rosh Hashanah. But actually, friends, in the Amoraic period, the Gemara and other sources in Ta'aniyot, it tells us that in Eretz Yisrael, also in Bavel, that the 3 fasts were not being kept. Now, remember, everyone continued until today have not ceased keeping Tisha B'Av, and virtually every Jewish community has this practice, right? So, what are we supposed to do today? Well, friends, the mission is clear in Rosh Hashanah 18b that in times of peace, we don't keep any of the 4 fasts at all, but instead rejoice on those days, right? This is the Mishnah. This is the Halakha. However, when we are experiencing times of mild to cold peace, then all of the 4 fasts are optional, with the exception of Tisha B'Av. And in times of persecution, every one of the 4 fasts are obligatory. Now, the Sugya in Rosh Hashanah 18b states, let them also go out for Tammuz and Tevet. Why do these messengers of the new moon go out for Tammuz and Tevet? So that they may fast in the diaspora on the correct dates. Rav Hana Bar Bizna said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Hasida, what is meant by the verse in Zechariah? Thus said the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month and the fast of the 5th month, the fast of the 7th month and the fast of the 10th month shall become occasions for joy and gladness for the house of Judah. It is called fast and it is called joy and gladness when there is peace, right? Sheyesh shalom, there shall be days of joy and gladness. But when there is no peace, ein shalom, there shall be a fast. I.e., at the present time there is no peace, hence there is an obligation to fast on the 4 fasts, and therefore we are obligated to send messengers for Tammuz and Tevet as well. Said Rav Papa, the verse is saying that when there is peace, they shall become occasions for joy and gladness. When there is persecution, right, shmad, thus we fast. If there is neither peace, if there is neither persecution, ein shmad, nor peace, ein shalom, if they wish, they fast. And if they do not want to, they do not fast. If so, should this not apply to Tisha B'Av as well? That if they wish, they fast, and if they don't, they do not fast? Said Rav Papa, Tisha B'Av is different, since troubles were multiplied therein. As the sage said in the Mishnah, on Tisha B'Av the temple was destroyed, both the first and the second, and Beitar was captured, and the city of Yerushalayim was plowed under. So, the big question is, what do we do today? And today we have a greater issue because we no longer have a Sanhedrin to help us make such a collective decision, right? If we're living in times of peace and mild peace or actual persecution. Well, friends, it seems to me that we are in an age of neither peace nor persecution, so at least Tisha B'Av should be kept. But that's just my opinion. However, what we do have is records on how the Geonim and even the Rishonim defined peace or persecution. However, with the development of the posik, people much later began to embrace a reality that was only relevant in and around the life of that posek, and then began to apply it globally. For example, if one takes the opinion of the Rambam and even the Rosh, which is what the Shulchan Aruch does, you would think that there is a law that one must observe all of the 4 fasts every year, no matter the climate of persecution. Why? Because in the times of these Rishonim, there was persecution, and thus, one was obligated to fast. However, if one just went back a few hundred years to the era of the Geonim and their students, the climate was one of Ein Shalom and Ein Shmad, or no peace and no persecution. So they only fasted for Tisha B'Av, like we said earlier, which is what they did in Bavon in the era of the Amoraim. Now, there are even those like Rashi and the Meiri who teach that one does not necessarily even need to have a temple standing for an era to be considered one of true peace. Which, if one is then a religious supporter of the Zionist ideology, which I am not, one could then conclude that due to the ethnic sovereignty enjoyed currently in the state of Israel by Jews, that one could cease fasting on Tisha B'Av altogether, which is the approach of rabbis such as Rabbi Bar Chaim. Actually, in some places like Kfar Chabad, there are people who actually refuse fasting on these days, mainly because they are of the opinion that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is the Jewish world's Messiah, and we are currently in some sort of messianic age. But this is a very, very tiny sliver of the Chabad movement. I personally am of the opinion that residing in the land of Israel is not enough, just like it wasn't enough when Jews were living under the rule of the Romans. In other words, I would say that in terms of outlook and ideology, a secular Zionist has as much in common with a Torah Jew as an ancient Roman does, which is why, at least in my humble opinion, we have Ein Shalom and Ein Shmad. So what? So we should absolutely be fasting on Tisha B'Av. And one should not think that when one prepares to fast or is fasting that they should in any way make a morbid spectacle out of it. right? Mourning a temple they've never seen and crying for people they've never met just because the calendar says so. Honestly, friends, mourning in Torah is really only tolerated when done for the dead. And mourning as a means of in any way impressing God does not exist. As a matter of fact, I'd be surprised if mourning for self-imposed loss, i.e. feeling sorry for ourselves because of ourselves, if that doesn't actually make the Almighty ashamed of His creation. In other words, this is really something that I believe was developed by secular Jews post the Holocaust. The act of mourning a loss and commemorating a defeat. No, friends, in Torah Judaism, we are ashamed of losses and rejoice in victory, and only mourn wasted opportunities. And friends, these fasts that only become mandatory in times of turmoil only really exist to remind us of past shame and to fuel present and future repentance. And this is why a fast day should not be taken lightly and, God forbid, just instituted as a yearly practice, stam. In other words, in Judaism, we fast as a way to shock our consciousness. And if a fast day is just thrown around, it loses its shock and awe.
And honestly, friends, if we know now, and you at least know now, that at the times of mild peace, the Tanaim didn't fast, nor did the Amoraim and even the Geonim, why suddenly do we have this desire to be firmer than Chazal? And at least that's one approach. Now, one could say that fasting or too much fasting is a bad thing, especially when we're not required to. For example, the Rambam brings down in Hilchot Taniyot that the purpose of fasting is ultimately to arouse our hearts and initiate our paths to repentance. Now, does this really sound so bad? And actually, it's also brought down that the only reason that we go to a cemetery to pray is to instill the same thing among us. However, friends, I think that the halakha should be made clear to the masses that at least for the three major rabbinic fasts, not including Tisha B'Av, that these fasts are optional, at least today. And in times of shmad, of persecution, we will all be required to fast. However, if you want to fast the optional fast, go right ahead. However, what you shouldn't do is condemn others who choose not to. And I know many on the extreme right will call this being makel, like they do when anyone chooses to emulate Chazal over the Gedolim of today. And honestly, friends, about 90% of the time when Haredim claim that someone is being makel, i.e. lenient on a certain issue, most likely 9 out of 10 times the person who is supposedly being lenient is actually following the halakha, and it is the other guy or group who's just being strict. Now, that being said, I honestly do not think that it is healthy when a generation has merited the option not to fast, and they should constantly live out their years in sackcloth and ashes, again, under some obsessive notion of better safe than sorry. Actually, this is the reason for personal fast at specific personal times of your life, not something to thrust upon the community as a whole, again, when the halakha does not require them to. So, what do you do, or what should you do? Friends, because we're living in times of peace to mild peace, one is not required to fast the 3 rabbinic fasts, not including Tisha B'Av, and those are the 3rd of Tishrei, the 10th of Tevet, and the 17th of Tammuz. Okay, that is the halakha. However, it is a real question that unfortunately no one could really say that by us having some sort of sovereignty in our land, should we then consider this a time of complete peace, even without a temple, which, i.e., would not require one to fast on Tisha B'Av, not to mention the other 3 fasts. Because, friends, many think, and I guess it's a real concern, that we might get punished for being overly lenient. But what some fail to understand is that we could just as easily get punished for being overly strict. In other words, by not appreciating peace when we have it, it could really show an ascetic, pompous ingratitude toward what our Creator has provided. So, I think that both approaches would suffice here. Again, regarding Tisha B'Av, in other words, one could choose not to fast based on his or his community's interpretation of peace and perhaps mild peace, on the principle of Safek de Rabbanan lehakel, right? As well as someone could choose to fast
again on Tisha B'Av, because like the Rambam and many others taught that the Jews during the time of Bayit Sheni and after continued to keep Tisha B'Av at a time of Ein Shalom and Ein Shema, the time of neither peace nor persecution, which many link to a time similar to what we're living today. And again, this is only for Tisha B'Av because, like we said, the other 3 fasts for sure you're not obligated to keep today. And Yom Kippur, like we said earlier, must always be kept no matter the climate. And friends, this is why the Jewish people are incomplete without a Beit Din Hagadol, without a Sanhedrin to help us decide such issues. Perhaps incomplete enough to require us to fast. So friends, for more information on everything Jewish, please visit bejewish.org. Thank you. Thank you.